But first, let's look at this latest closure of the New South Wales, the largest coal-fired power station in New South Wales. Treasurer Matt Kean is a controversial figure in Australian politics. He was Energy Minister and now Treasurer of the biggest state in Australia. He's led the push to get Australia to reach net zero by 2050. And despite a rocky history, Matt Kean is now very close to Malcolm Turnbull and often asks his advice on renewable energy. Kean even appointed Chair Turnbull to chair the Net Zero Emissions and Clean Economy Board. Before he faced such a backlash, he had to withdraw Turnbull's appointment. Matt Kean is also the leader of the moderate faction in New South Wales. This is the progressive faction that's been pushing for faster action on climate change. Matt Kean has led the push for renewable energy transition. At the same time, he's been rejecting the federal government campaign for more gas supply in New South Wales. He said supply just isn't an issue and it's not needed. But now there's a looming energy crisis in New South Wales, not in the distant future, but in just 3 years' time. The city that's the economic powerhouse of the country will likely face a problem keeping the lights on, and prices are unquestionably set to soar. Eraring, the state's largest coal-fired power station owned by Origin, has announced it will close its doors by August 2025. This is 7 years earlier than expected. Eraring supplies 20% of the state's energy. And Matt Kean is clearly worried about this. The renewable energy crusader said he's disappointed by the decision, and this speaks volumes in and of itself. If the most climate change-friendly politician in the country is concerned about the early closure of a coal-fired power station, this really does indicate that we're going to be facing a crisis of supply and pressure on prices. Matt Kean clearly knows the state isn't ready for this closure. Now, if you look closely at what the Australian Energy Market Operator, referred to as AEMO, has said, AEMO CEO Daniel Westerman has said in a statement that planned additional transmission capacity, including the announced battery, this is the battery that Matt Kean announced on the same day that we found out Eraring would close, will give the state access to enough electricity generation to meet the energy security target at the time Eraring closes. The CEO went on to say, this announcement also reaffirms the need for timely development of transmission projects identified in the draft 2022 Integrated System Plan. He said AEMO will now produce a comprehensive update to the annual reliability outlook. So while you will repeatedly hear Matt Kean in many interviews, including in the one I'm about to show you that I did with him a moment ago, he says that AEMO has given a guarantee that there's enough electricity supply without Eraring. When you actually look at that statement, it's AEMO saying that there will be enough access to electricity generation at the time Eraring closes. It doesn't say into the future. And the statement then goes on to say that it reaffirms the need to develop other projects for energy supply. So there is actually no guarantee here by AEMO that we will have reliable, stable energy in New South Wales to keep the lights on. And furthermore, that statement, you would have noticed, ended by saying that AEMO will now produce an update to their annual reliability outlook. That annual reliability outlook, this is the official forecast for electricity supply reliability over a 10-year period. Their forecast hasn't happened yet. The update hasn't happened yet after Origin announced Eraring would close just on Thursday. So it's quite misleading for the New South Wales government to say that their plan to supply enough energy when Eraring closes has been given the guarantee by AEMO. It hasn't. AEMO is still to update its forecasts. And here's another really crucial point. AEMO only models reliability and the minimum required to keep the lights on. It doesn't model price. All indications are that the Eraring closure is going to see electricity bills soaring. You'll remember that when Hazelwood closed in Victoria in 2017, the reaction was a price spike of 85% of wholesale prices, and that was compared to the 2016 prices. The wholesale price makes up around a third of your household residential electricity bill. And Hazelwood was smaller than Eraring is. There's also been publicly released modelling by the federal government on the impact of the Liddell coal-fired power station closing. And this modelling pointed to a price increase of 50%. Now, Eraring is worth 21% of the state's power supply. That's 2,880 megawatts. That's nearly double that of Liddell, which is 13% at 1,680 megawatts. Matt Kean has admitted that Origin first gave him the heads up at least 6 months ago that they were looking to close this Eraring coal-fired power station. But he never said a word to the federal government, keeping them out of the loop. He cites commercial incompetence. But of course the federal government is frequently involved in discussions about energy supply, even if they're commercial incompetence. But government sources tell me that Origin was open to extending the life cycle of Eraring, and that it might have been looking for a payment from the New South Wales government. This is similar to what happened with the Victorian government when it did a deal with Energy Australia to keep Ullern open for longer, extending its life cycle. The New South Wales government clearly decided not to do this. Instead, our electricity supply is at risk in just 3 years' time, and we're facing higher power prices. There's been no transparency about the negotiation over the past 6 months, no transparency about any of this. And there are now serious concerns about how we'll keep our lights on, how our state will continue to function with such an unreliable energy supply. You would have heard that Matt Kean has announced a battery, but it only has capacity for 700 megawatts. This is the equivalent of about 2 hours of energy supply. And even Matt Kean admits this isn't enough to provide energy into the market. So what is the plan to fill the energy supply shortfall caused by the early closure of our biggest coal-fired power station? Well, I'll tell you what, there is no plan at this stage. There is no plan that's been announced since Origin said it was closing Eraring, other than a battery that even Matt Kean admits will not contribute to the state's electricity supply because it's only 2 hours worth of energy. Now, to go back to what I said at the start, Matt Kean regularly seeks advice from Malcolm Turnbull on renewable energy. There's no evidence he's had any conversations with Turnbull about this topic. But what we've seen here in this whole sorry saga is ideology coming before energy security and reliability. We've seen an abysmal lack of planning from the New South Wales government, which has repeatedly poured cold water on the Morrison government's push for more gas supply in New South Wales. As a result, the biggest state in Australia looks like it could face rolling blackouts in just 3 years' time, come a routine heatwave, which we have often in New South Wales and in every part of Australia. And on top of this, it's going to be mums and dads, pensioners and other vulnerable people who struggle to pay their power bills and who won't be able to afford heating, lights or refrigeration because we know the power prices are going to rise. And this is something Matt Kean admits in my interview with him when I spoke to him just a minute ago. but welcome to the world of woke politics in the 2020s.